Welcome to a Cannaconvo episode of Cannabis Last Week. I have to give my standard disclaimer. By night, I fight crime as a mass vigilante, but by day, I practice law, cannabis and/or IP law at the law firm Lowell. So anything I state is my own opinion and not that of my law firm. If I was to say, for example, that George Allen is one of the tallest and best executives in the cannabis industry, well, actually, that would be a fact. So not a good example. And so I have the pleasure of introducing George Allen.
I'm not going to sue you for that one.
You're not going to have a problem with that one. So I have the pleasure of interviewing here George Allen, chairman of Lowell Farms. Thank you for joining.
Great. Thanks for having me. I couldn't be more excited to be here and talk about Lowell and what we're up to.
Yeah. So actually, on that note, there's some exciting news in terms of a new, we're breaking news on the podcast.
That's
here.
Right. That's right.
So, George, talk to me. What do you,
well, today we announced an exclusive partnership with Zippo. We're bringing them to market in California. I approached Zippo better part of 6 or 8 months ago and said, look, Zippo is an iconic brand, right? Zippo sat with our soldiers in trenches. Zippo's been with smokers since the dawn's earliest age. And frankly, it's a fantastic product, right? If you want to light something and it's windy outside, there's no better product than a Zippo. But they had no real presence in the sort of cannabis ecosystem. And that was something that I sort of saw as an opportunity, right? If you read what's available online, they've had sales sort of over time decline because of the decline of the smoker. And this is a brand that really sits perfectly aligned with what I think about cannabis, which is the way we build brands in cannabis is by showing off our consumption of cannabis, right? There was an early time and a heritage that we were all sort of apologizing for our use of cannabis and sort of hiding our use of cannabis. And we're now sort of crossing over into that next phase where it's time to start being proud about consuming cannabis. And Zippo was really a brand that sort of attached itself to smokers in that way. And I thought it's time for them to make the transition into cannabis consumer. Frankly, you just because you smoke cannabis versus maybe what used to be cigarettes for the consumer, it doesn't mean that you need a lighter on you less frequently. So you carry it now. And so if you're going to carry something that you need all the time, what's better looking than a Zippo product? It's absolutely iconic, and it has so much nostalgia and history and such an ever-present cultural icon. But I thought, wait a minute, if I can attach our brand to that and help them sort of cross the Rubicon into the cannabis landscape, then we have a mutually beneficial relationship. And I found an extremely receptive audience. They were really excited about making that transition. And so what the partnership that we've announced is we're their exclusive distributor into California dispensaries, and we're going to help them get more storefront, more shelf space into California dispensaries. But it's also about really attaching themselves to this cannabis consumer. And the way you have to do that is you have to go where it matters, where the influencer is. And the influencer in today's cannabis culture is the bud tender. So if you're not with the bud tender, you're against the bud tender. And so you have to go there. And we promise them, I can get you into that audience and allow you at least to showcase your capabilities. And if they're receptive to it, then you and I have a mutually beneficial relationship. So today is the beginning of that journey. And I think it's up to us and them together to make sure it's as successful as possible.
No, I think it's fantastic. As you said, right, it is an iconic brand. And it's funny sometimes that brands associated with smoking in the capacity haven't crossed over in any, to the cannabis market, like you said, because there's still that attached stigma. And I do think personally, when you're talking about, being out and proud, on-site consumption will help that, right? There'll be people out there smoking, normalizing it. They won't be stumbling around necessarily. Like people just think of it like bars.
That's exactly right. It's fun. It's fun to think about what's happening in this cannabis landscape, because in New York, for example, they have legalized smoking cannabis anywhere where you can smoke cigarette. Now, that's a big difference than the way they did it in California. And what's amazing is New York, what's emerging out of that is a little bit of a different cultural phenomenon than exists in California. California is still a little cloak and dagger behind it. And a lot of the brands that initially were successful in cannabis were really successful on this premise of concealment, right? Like if you think about the edible by its very nature has some physical attributes that are attractive, like delayed response and not having to actually smoke cannabis. But the primary feature, the primary utility function of the edible is concealment,
Mm-hmm.
right? I can ingest cannabis and nobody around me needs to know.
Yep.
That's great. And I think that was great for cannabis in the early days. But the problem with trying to build a brand around a product that's strictly based on private consumption is you lose the ability to market around that fundamental principle of something that has sex appeal and has real show off ability, right? Think about all the big categories of CPG products and consumer products that tend to get a lot of marketing budget and a lot of margin.
Mm-hmm.
They're all categories where you tend to see consumers showcasing that choice. Sneakers, collars, fashion, jewelry. Those are categories where people show off their consumption. And you look in cannabis, so many of the product form factors that we had were really focused on concealment. That's okay. And I'm happy for that. But if we want to cross out, and this is why I think Lowell is such a great brand. If we want to cross over into being a mainstream brand, that brand it doesn't have to be quietly, gently coming out of the closet. It has to come out of the closet dressed in its best clothes and look really good. And that's what Lowell does for the consumer. It says, you're smoking weed, but you're doing it in a way that nobody can criticize because it's so damn good looking and so outright sexy. And that's really what drives our brand. And I thought when I looked at Zippo, I think they have a very similar sort of appeal to them. So I was super excited about it. I was really grateful that they had they were receptive to the principle.
No, it makes sense in terms of the synergy of the quality and everything. And yes, right, we want to get to the point where all those stigmas are removed. And like you said, you're out and proud with loyalty to a specific brand.
That's right.
Right.
That's
and
right.
so you could, as I said, there aren't exactly many cannabis brands who say that they've been covered in the New Yorker.
Yeah,
right. So you're talking about the quality and level and recognition and everything that I think that Lowell's been so successful. And I also thought it was interesting. I was reading about that there's the fictional backstory, right?
Yeah.
Behind that. I thought that was a little interesting thing. I remember when I opened up a hookah bar in college, I had Smoky Waters was the name, and there was the backstory of Smoky Waters. But I thought that was funny. But I agree.
That may be our next product, Smoky Waters. I love it. Awesome.
Yeah, that was funny. So, I mean, obviously, yes. So New York is going to be interesting, but California is,
Well, New York and California are obviously the two magnets, polar magnets for anything cultural in this country. And I think, New York, watching how it embraces cannabis. But what they have done, and this is something that's also really important for just generally anybody in cannabis investing, is it has cemented the sort of supply chain of the black market in this country, because what New York did was they legalized it well before they created any avenue to actually buy the product. Yeah. And so when you do that, when you tell a consumer it's okay to have it, but we're not sure how you're going to get it.
Yeah.
You're telling them it's okay to go get it. And when they told them it's okay to go get it, the guy on Craigslist looks pretty damn good. And now the guy on Craigslist who basically is walking around with an ad and frankly has expanded to a booth on Canal Street, that has really cemented that channel. And I think the challenge that New York's going to have is sort of a redux of what we've had in California, which is actually creating a legal taxable market which can compete with the unregulated market.
Preaching to the choir. Yeah, and agreed. I mean, the worst example, by the way, of like propping up the unregulated market is Virginia with the 3-year gap right between decriminalization and when they're actually going to start sales.
Well, New York's going to be pretty darn close to it. I mean, New York's giving it a run for the money. And frankly, it wasn't until like a few months ago that New York actually medical program allowed you to even buy flower.
Exactly. No, it expanded very, very late. So I think that you're keying onto something really, really interesting in that the similarities between New York and California. And, curious, in a market with California that has its impediments in terms of, the taxation rates and everything, as you said, how have you guys built yourself in this position of strength? It's the focus on the brand, right? Ultimately. Right?
It's a 3-legged stool. It's around price, product quality, and brand. And you have to get all three of those right in California. The way I think about California, the reason why I went out to California and really sought after this journey is because California is the gauntlet, right? If you can be successful there, you're going to find a formula that is enduring and durable for the extended period of time. I kind of think about, and I was at Acreage for a long period of time, and the way I think about the MSO limited license marketplaces, there's a harvest to be had there in terms of profit.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're really doing is you're selling hot dogs inside the stadium, right? And back in the day when I got to go to baseball games, like those hot dogs sucked, right? And
Yes.
it's because they could sell anything they wanted, and it was overpriced. And so what's happening now is you've got this landscape where people are starting to bring in their own food into those stadiums, and that's the black market. And the black market's being taught that it can act with impunity. And when that happens, you're starting to see things like market share and pricing and price competition in some of those limited license markets that we all thought were these sort of walled gardens
Mm-hmm.
are becoming less and less so. And I think the more that we come to the table and recognize that what we're actually dealing with is one structural market collectively,
Mm-hmm.
the more you're going to understand this cannabis landscape, because it is. When California prices fall for cannabis, that's what hits the market in Illinois. That's what hits the market in New York. And so when prices fall in California, it's no surprise that we start seeing same-store sales growth decline in Illinois.
Exactly. Yeah, no, in the podcast and covering all of the news, at some point it clicked towards the tail end of last year that possibly the biggest story in the entire industry is California's struggle to tame the unregulated market. Because let's be honest, right? Going back decades, all of California's weed has moved eastward.
That's right.
Right. And the way that you tame the unregulated market in California is completely unique, right? But as a measure of, as you said, price, convenience, and product diversification and quality.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I remember it was a important story when I noticed that, unfortunately, some of these armed robberies that are happening now that the industry, post-pandemic is one of the only things with cash, was some of the robbers were robbing because the product was better, so they could sell it illegally.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? And some of the stats I saw from 2020 are like 11 billion is grown in California and only 5 is sold in the regulated market. And what I think is interesting, tying it back to brands is, I mean, I will just tell you anecdotally, right? Hanging out with my friends in New York and New Jersey, surprise, surprise, some California brands that fall off the market find their way there.
Oh, 100%. Some of those are knockoffs. Some of those are probably people who diverted the actual product at their own risk and peril. I think, but the reason for that is, believe it or not, among the street market in New York, that's becoming a competitive market, right? What are they doing? What do you do when it becomes a competitive market? I'm going to bring in the Stizzy brand. I'm going to bring in cookies. I'm going to bring in Lowell. I'm going to bring in brands that the consumer there can identify with. And that's why you see when you go to the bodegas in New York City and you go to the deli that's selling cannabis, that you can see those brands.
No, exactly. And I think that's, you'll move eastward. So, I mean, a question is, so you went to California, you sought this out. Why do you think that California is a unique opportunity going forward?
Well, I think that there are a few places in the world where you can get the stamp of brand credibility that you can get from California. And I think that's going to change over time. It's not because it is California. Like, let's be clear, like American consumers are not dying to consume anything Californian. And they're not even dying to consume anything that's Californian cannabis. But it's simply survival of the fittest.
Yep.
So what has risen to the very top of the pile in California, it satisfies something that's very visceral for the consumer. And brands and the way consumers respond to them, it's almost like music.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost impossible to itemize specifically about what it is a consumer responds to, because it's a perfect combination of ephemeral concepts and visual sensation that it's very hard to actually put a pin in it. But when you see it, it works. Just the same thing as with music. And I think what you've had in California is like, you've had a much more competitive environment to create that music, and you unlock that music into other markets. And lo and behold, what do you know? It resonates. It's not because it's California. It's just because you had a much bigger starting pool for the gene pool to sort of evolve into.
Yeah. So essentially, yes, competitive marketplace, you rise to the top. You've been tried and tested and succeeded there. You have a head start going into any other market because you could bring immediately something that, as you said, it just resonates instantly, right? Whatever that combination of factors is, that magic. We
became the second best selling pre-roll in Illinois and Massachusetts within months of launching in those markets. Now, thinking about who's in that markets, you've got all of the massive MSOs who are in that markets and who have massive marketing budgets.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't spend $1 on marketing that budget because I specifically didn't want the numbers to be altered. I wanted to see what happens if I take the seed crystal of the product and drop it into those markets to see how the consumer responds to the brand and the product. And what was amazing is the consumer found it. It's not because the consumer said, oh, Lowell, I heard about that from a college buddy. I think we want to think that Lowell has that kind of ever-present brand. Inside a company, you always want to think that your brand is really well known. I don't think that's the case. I think what happens is it has this sort of intangible set of qualities that allow a consumer to respond to it in a way that doesn't really happen, all that often. So people see it and they respond to it. What is that? I want to see that. And I've seen this with Lowell. If you take the pack and you put it on a table, it doesn't matter whether or not the person smokes cannabis. They respond to that pack almost immediately. It's got a magnet, it's got a box that slides, it's got a tactile feature to it. I mean, you actually, when you put a Lowell pack on a table, it almost invites you to touch it. It has a weird visceral feature like that. And that is something that's really disarming because if you're the consumer and you're coming home and you want to be more open about the fact that you smoke weed, it's a great way to introduce everyone around you to cannabis. It's disarming. No, I agree, right? Because we talk about the connoisseurs and the cannacurious, right? And how do you start breaking through the cannacurious? And I think that it's a question of product diversification and that legitimacy, right? Yeah. There's that, like you said, it's just a presence automatically, your product on a table with the look that I do think, frankly, is distinctive of a lot of brands in the market. And I'm not saying that there are other brands that have done it too. And I'm constantly looking out for brands that really invite. There's a mini pre-roll box that I just love in California. It's not our brand, but I absolutely love it because it has the same sort of visual curiosity. You almost look at the box and you say to yourself, how does that work? I need to get it in my hand so I can understand how it works. And then when you get it, you understand, you're like, oh, that's really beautiful. Yeah. And next thing you know, you bought the product. Yeah, right. It's interesting you talk about in terms of how it will automatically resonate, right? There is something I still like when I interact with different products on the market, Lowell, anything like that, where I feel like, Charlie being handed the golden ticket, to the chocolate factory. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Right. Where it's like, you're almost like a kid in a candy store or a kid in a toy store. Right. And you want to play with the toy. Yeah, exactly. Right? Like that type of nostalgic kind of appeal in some fashion, and I think that your product nails it. And I think it's a piece of the success. So I find that very interesting. Like you said, that it immediately resonated in those markets. And so, I'm curious about, expansion plans, right? So there was a partnership with an MSO to get you into the markets that you thought, made sense, right? And some, respect. Well, we hoped it made sense. You just don't know how the consumer is going to respond to it. It's a competitive market. Look, our product, we got to number 2 in Illinois, and because of the royalty fee that we charge our MSO partner, we're by far the most expensive product. So to get to the number 2 market share that we've gotten to at a price point that's 15 to 20% higher than our comparable products. The only way that happens is that some connection is made with the consumer. Yeah. And the quality to back it up. Yeah. Right. Ultimately. So, I'm also just curious in terms of, your thoughts on how the California market's going to evolve. As I said, I focus on this as a big story. I think that there are things that can certainly be done easily, like the cultivation tax, and there's the draft bill in relation to that. So I noticed that. I noticed New York right now, even before we come online, there's draft bills to minimize the impact of the state equivalent of 280E, right? So I'm starting to see, I like in the podcast, the macro noticing the trends, right? And I'm wondering that there might be a more deliberate approach by legislators, on the state level to, make sure that the state taxes aren't an issue when you're competing with strong and regulated markets. How do you think, the California market, the home base, will evolve over the next several years? In terms of, and progress, hopefully, with some of the issues. Well, I'm a bit of a contrarian on this one because what I'll say is, first of all, the thing that for quote unquote investors has made California a tough market is also the things that make it the best for a consumer, right? Mm-hmm. It's this concept of a constant supply of selection and choice that consumers get to make good decisions around. And they are constantly, they're spoiled with options. That is, in my opinion, like what is the best of California. And I wouldn't trade it for anything else because the home of cannabis in this world, the home of cannabis has to be a place that is the strongest will survive, and everybody gets a chance to compete, and that the best rises to the top. So that's a fundamental principle. So if you're going to build a brand, that has to be your home. It has to be your home, because otherwise, if you're going to try to come into that market and use credibility you gain from another market, and we've seen this in other places, it's really challenging to do. Now, the future of California cannabis, I actually think, and color me biased on this, but I actually think we've got a decent chance to flip over to being the healthiest market in the country. And the reason for that is the following. What I think they're on the precipice of doing in California is changing the tax profile for the consumer. There's two big components of that. There's really three big buckets of tax that get layered into legal cannabis, right? You got 280E. You've got the excise tax in retail excise tax, and then you've got cultivation tax. There's other taxes around the fringe, sales tax, and some manufacturing taxes, but those are the big ones, right? And so those end up being this wedding cake of expense that gets layered onto the product price for the consumer. And you compare that to the black market, which doesn't pay any of that tax. So we compete, right? We still have a $5 billion market competing at selling a product that's way more expensive than what we call the trap market in the trappers market in California. And California knows this. They see this, what you call an $11 billion market. I think it's higher than that. I think the illicit market here is probably twice the size of the legal market in California. So California sees this and they say to themselves, wait a minute, we're not allowing the cannabis consumer to come into dispensaries. And they only have two options. The two options are we can start putting people on handcuffs, or we can eliminate taxes from the legal product and make it more compelling. And we all know that in California, in today's political and cultural environment, there's zero appetite for putting people in handcuffs, and there shouldn't be, because there's too much of a heritage there that reminds people of the war on drugs. So we're not going to do that. We made our decision. We're not going to do that. So the only way to bring them into stores is to eliminate the tax. And I think there's 6 bills right now kicking around in the assembly in Sacramento to eliminate those taxes. I think we've got a good chance. Now, if they do that, if they actually eliminate the cultivation tax and severely, cut back on the excise tax, I think we're going to get as a price point at retail that is going to bring in this illicit market into the dispensary market. And then what you have is a legal market, I'll contend, is the healthiest legal market in all of cannabis, because it's got the cheapest products, right? It's got the best selection. And now you've got a price point that competes with what used to be the illicit market. So you're going to start to see cannabis tourism. And I think what we're going to start to see is black market is going to go from box trucks moving by quasi-organized crime to your college buddy dropping a FedEx pouch to you every 2 months. Right. I think that's what the future of cannabis, because price point in California is going to be there. I mean, there's relatively, we're teaching the consumer, especially the consumer who smokes a lot of weed. The law here is a super gray area at best. And so that consumer's already been taught to go to the illicit market, but now they're going to get the benefit of a lower retail price point in California, plus all the quality that they want. So I think what you're going to do is you're going to take California, which has got this low cost inventory priced right, and the market's going to balloon there. The rest of these MSM markets, what you're going to be left with is you're going to be left with $4,000 feedstock weed trying to go into dispensaries and still competing with that illicit product that's coming from California. And unless they stop that illicit product coming from Oklahoma and California and Mexico and all the other places it comes from, unless they stop that, you're going to continue to see that your most avid consumer of cannabis is gonna be defecting over to the illicit market for price. And that's the biggest challenge we have in cannabis. And I love the Canna Curious. But your biggest portion of this market is your weed needers. And there's a lot of people out there who need weed on a daily basis. I think the latest data I've seen is that 62% by number of consumers smoke cannabis at least one time a day, and 48% smoke more than one time a day. Now, if you think about that consumer needs weed. Right? If you're going to smoke it every single day or multiple times a day, You absolutely need weed, and you're very price conscious when you get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
So that consumer is the one we're losing to that illicit market because it's a dollars and cents argument. Right?
Yeah. No.
So I think that's the opportunity that California has, which is to grab them first. And the rest of the market's gonna be like, wait, we can't replicate that because we don't have the feedstock that California does.
Got it.
So this is going to be the precursor, I believe, to interstate commerce.
So yeah, which was also a super fascinating topic. So, I mean, you think that it might be even so simple as really like attacking the cultivation tax. There are bills to do it. Gavin Newsom's already referenced it, I believe, at the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
Right. So it's even on his radar. And then you shift that, you increase the profitability of every single company, right, in the California market.
I think that, well, you got to remember, profitability is not a function of taxation.
Yeah.
Price point is a function of taxation.
Yeah.
I think profitability in California may move around a little bit, but ultimately in a competitive market, the price is going to go to the consumer. I think what you're going to see is the pie is going to grow. I think the pie is going to grow.
Okay, got it. And then, interstate commerce, I'm curious, by the way, because you've seen some of these initiatives that they're talking about, Washington, Oregon, and California teaming up, right? And just saying,
come on in, the water's warm.
F it, we might just start shipping. What are you going to do about it, federal government? But I find that really interesting, right? So you think, so there's the opportunity with just some pretty logical common sense tweaks, right? That California evolves to what it could be, right? I mean, that it could have been from the beginning. Frankly, I don't know why other states, when they come online, I mean, this is actually built into Schumer's draft bill, right? The idea of an increasing tax rate, right? You come in low taxation to knock out the unregulated market, right? And then you ramp it up as the market matures, but barely any states touch that model. And I think it's because they salivate over being able to say, look at all the tax revenue that we made, right? Out here, we could justify this to all the voters who weren't necessarily on board when we're funding schools and programs and all that. And it's politics dictating policy rather than what would, help the market be strong from the start.
Totally agree. And I think that is the biggest challenge that we face going forward. I think the end state here is also really fascinating to think about. One thing that happened in Canada, and Canada is actually a market that we don't spend enough time talking about because Canada is in front of us. And what happened in Canada is gross margins at retail in Canada are about 30 points. Our gross margins in California are about 59, 60 points. And for the rest of the MSO landscape is around 50 points at retail. Now, Canada's at 30 points. And that's part of the story as to why Canada has eliminated the black market, is because the markup that's happening at the final price point or at retail is so much lower. And the reason the way Canada did that was like they stepped in and provided a function. They were actually the distributor of record in the entire country, right? So each province is its own distributor. And by doing that, they kind of put and actually what they did was the distributors allowed mail order. So every product has a price cap because the province will sell it to you by mail at a 30% premium to wholesale. So right there, no retailer can go above that price point. Because that's your price ceiling. Otherwise, the consumer's just going to walk out and order it online. And so that kind of trained the consumer and trained retailers to make it work at 30 points of margin. And when they made it work at 30 points of margin, suddenly the economics that were available to the black market were a lot lower. So the black markets, without putting people in handcuffs, the black market in Canada has sort of all but driven into the darkest corners of the country. And I think that's an opportunity that we have here. And look, I understand that we don't want to talk about, there are people who I'll get hate mail on LinkedIn when I talk about things like the black market, because people say, wait a minute, that's the legacy market. And just be clear, I don't want to equate the challenges that I have with the illicit market to the challenges that other people have with the limited license market, because the limited license market they've restricted access, right? And they've created good margins by restricting access. But in California, or in California, it's a very democratic market. If you play by the rules, you can participate. And so from my standpoint, I think it's the healthiest market structure that we have. We need a little help from the government to fix it. Yeah, no, 100% agreed. And, the problem isn't the unregulated market, it's the unequal enforcement of laws, right? That's been the problem.